Okay, thanks, Brad. All right, let me know if I back up too much from the mic or whatever. So basically today, a little bit of background on the talk. It's called Light Lessons Using Everydays to Develop Your Craft. As I was coming up with the idea, so let me back up, I guess. I've been working as an illustrator for about 10 years, and around, I'd say, two and a half years ago, I started posting artwork to Instagram. Now this artwork started off as primarily kind of illustrations, things like that, of that nature, a lot of 3D stuff, because I kind of wanted to jump in and start like learning the programs a little better. And then as time developed and kind of continuing on, basically what I ended up finding was a lot of the lessons I was learning weren't so much even just the technical ones, but a lot of like theoretical ones. And theoretical may not be the right word, but what I'm talking about is kind of ideas such as like lighting, composition, things like that, that helps inform a lot of our stuff that we do. And so I wanted to talk today about kind of that progression and then share towards the end of the talk a demo showing some examples and some tips I learned. Now for those that don't know, I connected with some of you guys on Instagram, but for those that don't know the type of work I do, I put together a little clip showing some stuff that I'm talking about. Hope it won't be too loud. So basically a lot of the stuff in there, you saw it wasn't necessarily medical in nature, but the idea is that what it kind of taught me, and that's kind of the process I want to talk about, like essentially the lessons it taught me, that how I apply them to the work that I do. So again, just to cover the agenda, basically talked about all that stuff. So jump in. Basically, all right, so the everydays themselves. So everydays, I'm using that term for the stuff that I'm posting on Instagram, but it can be anything, kind of, keeping a sketchbook, taking a photo every day, things like that on your phone, whatever it is, but kind of, basically the idea is getting into a habit of kind of creating some sort of artwork. And the reason people do this type of stuff, there are a lot of talks on kind of the pros and cons of doing this sort of practice. But the reason why I did it in particular was to learn and create. When I started this process, probably about a year prior, I'd kind of switched over one of the programs that I used, the main program. I switched from 3ds Max to Cinema 4D, and I wanted to kind of learn Cinema 4D a little bit better. I saw a lot of tutorials, things of that nature, but I didn't really feel appropriate or comfortable kind of like troubleshooting like on a particular job. So I kind of just, took like nights and weekends, things like that, to start like creating my own artwork. And then the reason why I started posting on Instagram was basically to make myself a little more accountable for doing that. Because, I'd have a week where I did a bunch and then like 2 weeks where I didn't. So what I wanted to do was kind of almost treat it like a homework assignment. And it kind of, it's not most exciting when you put it that way, but it kind of forced me to go in and actively seek out something, I guess, if that makes sense. So, aside from, because the main things, like I said, software and features. So aside from the individual software themselves, the features I found were constantly changing too. It wasn't a school anymore, so I couldn't necessarily rely on, just jumping in and learning something. I had to kind of keep up with everything as well. And most importantly, it also kind of gave me inspiration. Here we, have the salon and, kind of seeing other people's artwork, things like that. On Instagram, you're able to do that and kind of keep in touch with people as well. So, that's all the good stuff about it. And there's also a downside to doing this stuff too. The social aspect, while it does make you accountable, things like that, you can also kind of go down a slippery slope a little bit. You can start like chasing likes, people talk about that kind of stuff. You start second guessing your own work. Something that you feel like super pumped about gets like 4 likes, you're like, what was the point of that, And then you start like thinking, well, maybe I'm doing something wrong and all this stuff, and your work can become stagnant because you'll fall into a situation where like a bunch of stuff is successful, and then you'll get really happy about that, but then you'll just keep doing that stuff over and over again. And so you don't want that, because you want to continue to grow and create. And it's also time consuming. We all have jobs, we all have lives, and we want to maintain those. And this can also, to do something where you're kind of set out to learn a particular skill set, it takes time. And so because it takes time, the quality of the work can also suffer, and then you feel a little, it's a two-edged sword, double-edged sword, I guess. You don't want to necessarily post something that you're not happy about, or not even the work, this type of work. It could be the work that you're doing for your 9 to 5. That can start to suffer because you start burning candle on both ends, I guess I don't know the exact phrase, but essentially what you're doing, you're overworking yourself. And so when that happens, you just take a break. Like, I call them every days, but, every days. But you don't want to put yourself in a situation where you're hurting yourself also. And so, you take a break. And also, what I did, in addition to taking a break, was started posting different types of work. So instead of sticking just into 3D, I kind of started shifting more towards introducing a little bit of photography, kind of some sketches, things like that. And so those lessons essentially, like I said, the goals and practice evolved to include other types of artwork. And those lessons I found by posting that type of artwork, I learned lessons, and those lessons then informed the type of work that I do. Because it wasn't necessarily a situation, I'm going to be talking about lighting today, and it wasn't a situation where I was like, all right, I want to go and learn lighting, go all in on it. Obviously, like as I'm kind of figuring out, learning 3D and things like that, I remember when I first started off, like it was a 3-point setup, in 3D space, and then it kind of switched to like image-based lighting. Then it switched to HDRIs, and now you have a lot of GPU rendering. So it's constantly evolving. So that's going to continue, regardless of the type of work you do, whether it's illustration, animation, any type of visualization. The technologies are changing, everything's changing, but the main principles are kind of constant throughout. And what I found basically was that I was able to. What's the best way of putting it? I was able to kind of get a better vocabulary. I recognized what worked and what didn't a little quicker, a little more confidence, and also just it made sense, and I was able to kind of make adjustments on the fly like a little quicker in my work, if that makes sense. And if there are any questions, I guess no questions, but you know what I mean. But feel free to jump in. So yeah, I talked about this stuff already, but basically, initially started off kind of building a technical skill set and then went to a theoretical one. And the technical stuff wasn't necessarily just lighting. It was also, everything in kind of our day-to-day stuff. For me, it's Cinema 4D, ZBrush, Photoshop, a lot of the Adobe products. And then within that, there's MoGraph, physical render, Substance, and you could do a whole like talk or kind of, devote 20 minutes to each one of these topics. Today I'm going to focus on lighting in particular. But basically the main kind of point is, and that's kind of the purpose of this part of the talk, I wanted to kind of express that the practice of every day is kind of, it gives you a little bit of, you've heard that term like 10,000 hours. It gives you a little bit of that. I don't know if I'm there yet by any means, but it's kind of constant evolution of our work. And I think it's something that's important, otherwise you can sometimes get lost in figuring out why you're doing it. So I'll just go through these kind of quickly, but I just posted some examples. So here's some like MoGraph stuff, Pro Render. A lot of the shift of the stuff we do nowadays is off to GPU rendering. And this is kind of some tests with that. Substance Designer. Substance Designer is kind of a unique product. Haven't really delved too much into it, but the main thing is kind of you can like create your own textures, things like that. And creating textures is also another form of, when you consider it in terms of like lighting, modeling, things like that, it's another form of like observation. You're like looking at the world around you type thing, even the texture on this desk, and that's going to affect kind of your eye. Train your eye, I guess, if that makes sense. And then outside of, that world, the cinema world, looking at modeling too. So learning ZBrush in terms of, like kind of the new features as they come about, be it like the Boolean operations that Andrew was talking about this morning, or even, like Z model or things like that. It kind of keeps you up to date with a lot of that stuff. And then, shifting over to photography. Yeah, photography is kind of nice. Like, we all have, well, a lot of us have smartphones now, and it's just very easy. It makes it much more accessible. And one of the things I like, I'm a sucker for sunrises and sunsets. Like, you get a lot of cool interplay, and even just like, walking down the street, like you kind of see certain things. Even on the drive over this morning, there's a really nice sunrise, but couldn't take a picture because of the new Georgia law, I guess, but it's probably for the best. And then lighting again. And so outside of even photography, you start impacting like your illustration work itself, kind of the 3D work. And so what I'm going to do is now kind of shift gears and talk about like the lighting in particular. Kind of touch on that first point about the constant back and forth between illustration and photography. And also like the workflow evolved, I guess, in the sense of, starting off with kind of a simple 3-point setup to then shifting as the technology like moved on, things like that. And then one of the things, in addition to this kind of everydays, is one of the features of Instagram. And I don't know how many folks out there use Instagram, but this is my first jump into social media, so I was a little hesitant. I thought it was going to be a fad and it was going to blow over, but that didn't happen. So I was like, all right, I got to get on board. But one of the things I found was that even within Instagram, not all the photos that I post are necessarily edited in Photoshop and things like that, but there's a lot of processing you can do within that software itself. And without getting into, I should have done some screenshots, but too many details. If you go under Edit, and then you can kind of select the highlights and the shadows in particular, so you can adjust, stuff that's similar to like curves, levels, things like that you see in Photoshop. But you can also adjust the color of the highlights. And I started playing around with that a little more and more, obviously without to the point of getting, overly filtered or whatever you want to call it, or overly processed. But it kind of brought up some points in terms of the ability to kind of affect light and almost like sculpting or painting with light, if that makes sense. And one of the other things is also, going back to the world of 3D and everything, is multipass rendering. I started doing that pretty recently, and multipass rendering is a huge boon because before you were kind of, not limited, but you wanted it to look right, and so you just kept pushing and pushing it and trying to figure out all the parameters. But with multipass, you have the ability to go in and kind of change things accordingly. And in the interest of time, I'll kind of jump ahead. So basically there are 2 demos I want to do, like one of a photo and one of an illustration. The colors may be a little, I kind of pushed them a little bit, but I didn't take into account this. So they're a little red, I guess, but we'll go with it. So essentially what I'm going to talk about is doing a lot of these edits and things like that in Photoshop. I chose Photoshop because I figure that's something common to what a lot of us use without kind of getting into the nitty-gritty, but I'd certainly be happy to talk about at least some of the workflow that I use for Cinema 4D. I'm more familiar with that program. So I'm going to jump out and go into Photoshop. And that's the outline. You weren't supposed to see that. But it's a pretty straightforward process. So does that look okay? So basically what I'm going to show is how to go from something like this, from this to this. Now, this is just one technique. It's not going to be kind of the end-all be-all. I mean, this worked for this particular image, but there's a lot of different techniques out there, and I'll provide some references at the end and resources kind of showing what I was talking about. But so let's go ahead. The main thing we're going to be doing is basically looking at curves, dodge and burn, and then a feature called apply image. Now, do people use apply image? You know what I'm talking about it within Photoshop? Say again? Apply image. Apply image. So it's underneath image right here. And right now it's grayed out because I don't have anything selected. Right there. It's basically, it's a nice feature, and I'm going to show kind of some of the, like they use it a lot in photography for portrait retouching. So there's a technique called high frequency separation. What you do is essentially, if you want to preserve kind of the pores and the details, texture of the skin, while still like changing some of the underlying tones, this is a way that they do that. And that's kind of became, I first heard about it with that, within that world of portrait retouching, but I found that you can apply it to other things as well. And so enough talk, I'll show you some stuff, how to do things. So basically, went in and deleted the kind of the dodge and burn layer. So what you're going to do first is create a new adjustment layer called curves. And everyone's pretty familiar with curves. Quick recap for those who aren't, just how to read one of these guys. So the bottom here is your input, and the top is your output. Essentially what you're looking at is kind of the levels from 0 to 255, all the lights and the darks, and then the up and down is essentially making adjustments to those individual inputs. And so, I mean, this image right here is okay. I mean, it has a nice, like curve, like it has its low lights and highlights, things like that. But the day I took this photo, I was actually outside of my apartment complex. I'd gotten like a new lens or whatever, so I was playing around with the lens, a nice depth of field and things like that. But it was sunset at that time, and there was it was backlit very nicely, this scene. And you lost a little bit of that here, I felt. You see some yellows and things like that, some reds up here, but it wasn't necessarily to the point of what it was that day. So I was like, all right, let's go and make some adjustments. Now, typically, at least when I used to use curves a lot, like I just do kind of this, standard S curve. You bring your highlights up, your shadows down, call it a day. But I found and that does work. I mean, I'm not knocking the, regular just kind of curves adjustment or levels adjustments, because they are beneficial. But what you wanted to do, kind of going back to the point of in Instagram, how you can kind of isolate your highlights, or, in multipass, if you bring out your reflections and your lights as separate passes, you can like start altering them. That's kind of what I wanted to do here, but it's the photos. How do you do that? Well, one thing I found that was kind of beneficial was, and this goes into dodging and burning, kind of segues in. So what you do first is kind of basically just take this and then bring it up. Just kind of, it's like essentially you're putting a big dodge stamp on the entire piece of art. But then what we're going to do is then go into the blend if mode. And what blend if does is basically it knocks out kind of the areas of if I'm explaining this right, the areas below that are going to be affected by the darks here. And so it'll make sense once you start doing it. So what's going to happen is it's going to start creeping in, and you see kind of these areas that are being like knocked out. So what's that's going to do, like all of the stuff in white, that's only what's going to be affected. Now it's a little harsh, so what you can do is basically if you hit Option or Alt, you can take these and start feathering them out a little bit. So what you've effectively done is kind of separated out the highlights themselves. So this is all in a separate layer. Now if I wanted to go in and just basically add an adjustment layer to this then, like a hue saturation, things like that, you can. I found that doing it, it kind of, it's not so subtle. Like it's a pretty strong effect. So what I do is use this technique called for apply image. And what apply image is that, so what I'll do first is basically make a merged copy of everything that's visible right now. So I'll take the vignette off. That's Shift Option Command E. And that basically merges everything that's visible. And so merges, but also duplicates it. Then what you'll do is go up to, so I'll call this dodge. Go up to image, apply image. And right now it looks a little weird, but basically, in the interest of time, I'm not going to go into the full details of this, but feel free to come up or I can kind of provide you guys some references. Essentially what you're going to do is right here, basically, there's a layer merge. And so what you're going to do, you're telling this dodge layer, like this is your target layer, and the source is this document. So you want, instead of, you want the target layer to be, let me step back here. All right, so this is the normal layer. So what you're going to do is, right now the blending mode is happening, is multiply. And what you want is actually subtract. So what that's going to do, if you can see it, I think you can't see it clearly up there. Basically, it knocked everything back to, what it does is looks at the luminance values of the two layers, and it subtracts the target from the source, and what you're left with is 0. But then since the offset is 128, which is basically the middle point of gray, you're essentially left like right in the middle of a gray value. And so the gray value, what that'll do is basically knock everything into this mode, and then you can put this into these contrast modes right here, overlay, or soft light. Excuse me, soft light. What you've effectively done is basically, it's a little tough to see, but you've essentially isolated that particular layer. And then to this layer, what you can do is go in and make a hue saturation. So you knock this back to like, obviously we don't want pink, but something like that. And what we'll do is put a clipping path on it so it only affects this top layer right here. And then similarly, what you'll do is basically a duplicate of this operation for the burn. I know I'm at 0 right now. Is it okay if I go a little bit? All right. So I'll duplicate this again. Curve adjustment layer. And instead of this time going up, what we're going to do is go down right here. I'm Shift E. Take apply image. What we're going to do is subtract all of this from the normal right here. And okay. Oh, sorry, I take that back. Forgot a step. And what this does, it basically isolates the darker areas right there. Now, merge that together. Do an apply image, and what we're left with, this area right here, is the one selected. Then what I can do is apply, in this case, let's do a color balance. First, let me put this in soft light mode so you can see what's going on. Essentially what that looks like that. And what this does, pushes things towards the red. And you can add a vignette on top to kind of like put it all together. So essentially what you're doing is kind of this technique is what it does is it gives you manual control over kind of some procedural techniques. I realize I'm out of time, but you can also do this for kind of illustrations itself. And so start it off with something like this, and then basically with more or less a few clicks, you can kind of go to using the same technique, dodging and burning, isolating the highlights, isolating the shadows, and then kind of coming in and making adjustments to them as needed. For instance, made those a little cooler, add this yellow right here. Let me take this off. First it was this, kind of targeting the lights, targeting the shadows, then adding this on top. Yeah, so basically that's it. But one thing I wanted to show was, if that was a little quick, kind of what I was talking about with the apply image stuff, these guys right here, they're all more or less kind of photo editors, but they have a pretty good explanation. And this person right here, Pixel Perfect, he actually has a pretty cool video that explains it very nicely, kind of the exact process that I just did. So I encourage you to check it out. And with all the stuff, kind of the everydays and everything, it's just a matter of kind of going out there and creating stuff and take those lessons and then applying them to what you do. So, thank you.